Good evening, friends. Welcome to Historian's Lullaby. I am trying an experiment with this video, using my own voice to narrate it instead of one generated by AI. If you prefer a real human voice, please let me know in the comments. Tonight, as you snuggle up with your favorite blanket, the crackling sound of the fire, and a mug of sleepy time tea, indulge yourself with this tale of the Underground Railroad. But before you drift off, please like this video, subscribe to this channel, and share it with someone that you know is awake but dreaming about freedom. When we hear Underground Railroad, our minds often leap to images of Harriet Tubman, coded lantern signals, and daring night journeys. But the very beginnings of this network were quieter, smaller, and, in many ways, more fragile. Our story begins not with famous names like Harriet Tubman or Thomas Garrett in the 1800s freeing slaves in the North, but rather with the importation of slaves to Spanish Florida and Mexico. As early as the 16th century, Spaniards brought enslaved Africans to New Spain, including the colony of St. Augustine. Yet Spanish law and Catholic tradition created a different reality than that of the British colonies to the north. Enslaved people in Spanish Florida could be baptized, marry, and in some cases, even earn freedom. By the 1730s, King Charles II of Spain went further. He declared Florida a safe haven for fugitives escaping from British America. The response was immediate. Runaways came south in the hundreds, some traveling from as far as New York. To shelter them, the Spanish established Fort Mose in 1738, the first legally sanctioned free black settlement in what would become the United States. Here, families worked trades, farmed, and defended the fort in the colonial militia. It was a radical contrast. In the British colonies, enslaved people were property, barred from legal marriage and subject to brutal punishment. In Spanish Florida, fugitives were recognized as human beings. Imperfectly, yes, but enough to plant the dream of freedom. The southern borderlands also became a beacon. In 1806, enslaved men reached the stone fort at Nacogdoches, Texas, carrying a forged passport. Spanish officials refused to return them, signaling a dangerous idea to the United States. South of the border, freedom might be possible. The promise grew in 1829 when Mexican President Vicente Guerrero, himself of mixed race, abolished slavery outright. For enslaved people in Louisiana, Mississippi, and Texas, Mexico became what Canada would later be, a sanctuary. Crossing the Rio Grande meant crossing into liberty. But Mexico's stance was complicated. On one hand, fugitives could marry, join the church, and live freely. On the other, Mexico sometimes bowed to U.S. pressure, returning runaways or permitting American settlers to bring enslaved labor into northern provinces. The contradiction was stark. The nation outlawed slavery while simultaneously enabling its practice. This tension played out violently during the War of 1812, when U.S. troops under Andrew Jackson invaded Spanish Florida, partly to stem the tide of escape. Runaways had joined Seminole allies, the beginnings of the Black Seminoles, some of whom later migrated into Mexico itself. And in Texas, slavery's fate became inseparable from politics. The Texas Revolution of 1836 was fueled in part by the desire of Anglo-American settlers to preserve slavery against Mexico's abolitionist law. When Texas joined the Union in 1845 as a slave state, the Rio Grande became both an international border and a symbolic line between bondage and freedom. By the mid-19th century, the map of North America was defined by this contest. To the north, Canada beckoned as a free haven. To the south, Mexico represented another pathway out of slavery. And within the United States itself, the free states and slave states were locked in a political tug-of-war. Each new state added to the Union tilted the balance of Congress. Freedom on one side, bondage on the other. It is within this shifting, contested landscape that the Underground Railroad would emerge. The fugitives who braved swamps, rivers, and forests were not inventing something new. They were stepping into a centuries-long tradition of seeking freedom across hostile borders. Before lanterns and safe houses, there was Fort Mose. Before Harriet Tubman, there were the Black Seminoles. The Underground Railroad did not appear out of nowhere. It was the flowering of a resistance rooted in centuries of struggle. As such, in the late 18th century, the idea of resisting slavery was still radical in America. And yet, within Quaker meeting houses and free black churches, the seeds of organized escape were being planted. Through the abstracts of history, we can sometimes forget that there were real people with real lives on the line, helping slaves reach freedom. Let's briefly meet some of the main players who laid the tracks for the Underground Railroad. The Religious Society of Friends, the Quakers, were among the first white religious groups to collectively condemn slavery. By the mid-1700s, voices like John Woolman and Anthony Benezet were urging their fellow friends to see slavery as incompatible with Christian teaching. Woolman traveled from meeting to meeting, quietly but firmly urging Quakers to set their enslaved people free. Benezet went further, establishing schools for black American children and writing pamphlets that circulated widely in the colonies and Europe. This moral groundwork matters because when enslaved people began escaping in greater numbers, there was already a religious community prepared, at least in part, to act. Quakers had discipline, meeting houses, and a commitment to moral action. All of these would become invaluable for what followed. If the Underground Railroad had a founding father, it might be Isaac T. Hopper. Isaac Tatum Hopper was born on December 3, 1771, in Woodbury, New Jersey, into a Quaker farming family. The Religious Society of Friends was not only his faith community, but also the culture that formed his earliest sense of right and wrong. Quaker values emphasized simplicity, honesty, and equality, ideals that ran against the grain of society where slavery was still legal. As a boy, Hopper absorbed the rhythms of rural Quaker life, plain speech, community worship, and the steady expectation of integrity in all dealings. Quakers at the time were in the midst of a moral awakening about slavery. By the 1770s and 1780s, the Philadelphia Yearly Meeting, the governing body of Quakers in the region, was moving toward formally condemning slaveholding. These debates filtered down into Hopper's childhood world, giving him an early exposure to the conviction that enslaving others was a spiritual wrong. Hopper's personality also seemed tuned to dissent from a young age. Family stories describe him as curious, sharp-witted, and quick to speak his mind, traits that later made him famous for outsmarting slave catchers in court. As a teenager, he apprenticed as a tailor in Philadelphia, where he encountered the city's diverse population, including free black residents and the shadow of slavery that still hung over Pennsylvania. This exposure to urban injustice sharpened his sense of empathy and gave him first-hand insight into how slavery degraded human dignity. Though nothing in his youth suggested the scale of activism he would later embrace, Hopper's Quaker upbringing, rural simplicity, and early encounters with both slavery and freedom combined to form a conscience ready to act. His childhood prepared the ground for the bold abolitionist who would one day become legendary in Philadelphia. Starting in the 1790s, he began assisting fugitives directly. He learned how to exploit legal loopholes, file last-minute petitions, and buy time until a freedom seeker could slip away. Hopper would also go on to organize safe houses in Philadelphia, an early version of what later abolitionists would call a station on the railroad. Hopper's work set a precedent. The Underground Railroad was never just about hiding people. It was also about using wit, law, and community networks to chip away at the slave system's control. While Quakers offered critical support, the Underground Railroad's true backbone was built by free black communities. In cities like Philadelphia, New York, and Boston, black churches and mutual aid societies provided the infrastructure that made escapes possible. Here, the stakes were higher. If caught, free black leaders could be kidnapped and sold south themselves. Yet they persisted, knowing that their own freedom was bound up with those still enslaved. A central figure in this story is David Ruggles. Ruggles was born free in Newark, Connecticut, in March 1810, into a large family of free black New Englanders. His parents, David and Nancy Ruggles, were respected members of the community, his father working as a drayman, a carter who hauled goods, and his mother known for her piety and resilience. Unlike many African Americans at the time, the Ruggles family had not been enslaved in recent generations, which gave young Dave the foundation of stability and dignity that so many others were denied. Newark itself was an important backdrop for this upbringing. It was a bustling port town with shipping links that exposed its residents to ideas, people, and cultures from beyond rural New England. Yet it was also a place where racism and discrimination were daily realities. Growing up in a free black household amid a majority white population, Ruggles would have both felt the possibilities and the sharp limitations of freedom in America. From an early age, Ruggles showed both intelligence and boldness. He received some basic schooling, rare for black children in the early 19th century, and he developed a strong appetite for reading. Accounts suggest that he worked as a youth in printing and book-related trades, including as an apprentice to a local printer. This exposure to the world of books, pamphlets, and the printed word gave him tools that would later prove decisive: literacy, publishing skills, and a keen understanding of how ideas could spark change. By the time he was a teenager, Ruggles had already begun to separate himself from the narrow role society expected of free black men. His upbringing in a free household, his exposure to both opportunity and prejudice in Newark, and his early connection to print culture all combined to prepare him for the fearless activism he would later embody. In the 1830s, Ruggles founded the New York Committee of Vigilance, one of the first organizations dedicated to protecting fugitives from capture. Ruggles personally sheltered hundreds, including a young Frederick Douglass. When Douglass escaped in 1838, exhausted and terrified, it was Ruggles's home in Manhattan that took him in. That moment illustrates a truth often overlooked. Before Douglass became the voice of abolition, he was the beneficiary of a network already in place. Meanwhile, in the Midwest, a Quaker couple was quietly building a reputation that would become legendary. Levi Coffin was born in 1798 in Guilford County, North Carolina, into a Quaker farming family. His childhood unfolded in a region where slavery was everywhere. Neighbors owned enslaved people, and the institution shaped daily life. From a young age, Levi showed a strong moral sensitivity. Family stories recall that at age 7, he saw a group of enslaved people driven past his home in chains and asked why such cruelty was allowed. That moment stayed with him. Life on the farm instilled discipline and resourcefulness, but Quaker teachings gave Levi his moral compass. Quakers in North Carolina were divided on slavery, yet his family leaned toward abolitionist sentiment. These influences combined the practical resilience of farm life and the deep, early conviction that slavery was wrong. By the time Coffin reached adulthood, the seeds of his later reputation as the president of the Underground Railroad had already been sown. He would go on to marry Catherine White. Catherine was born in 1803 in North Carolina and also came from a Quaker background. Like her future husband, Levi, Catherine grew up surrounded by slavery's daily realities. While less is documented about her childhood, her upbringing instilled a commitment to service and compassion, hallmarks of Quaker womanhood at the time. Catherine's early life trained her in domestic skills, cooking, sewing, and managing a household, which later became crucial in aiding fugitives. Providing food, clothing, and comfort required as much courage as Levi's public actions. Her quiet strength, rooted in her formative years, shaped her into an indispensable partner in their shared mission. It was in the red earth fields of North Carolina that Levi Coffin first noticed Catherine White. Catherine's kindness stood out. She had a steady way about her, as if compassion were her natural language. Levi was already restless, carrying in his heart a growing unease at the sight of enslaved people chained and driven down the roads near his family's farm. Catherine shared that same discomfort, though she carried it in silence. When their paths crossed, it was less a spark than a recognition. Here was someone who felt as he did, someone whose spirit leaned towards mercy and freedom. They married in 1821, joining not just households, but purposes. Soon after, they left for Indiana, hoping for a freer soil on which to plant their lives. Their marriage was not a retreat into private life, but the beginning of a lifelong partnership in defiance of slavery. Their house became known as the Grand Central Station of the Underground Railroad. Coffin was sometimes called its president, but he often deflected the title, pointing instead to the bravery of those who risked everything to escape. What made the Coffins unique was their visibility. Unlike many conductors who operated in secrecy, the Coffins lived openly as abolitionists in communities that largely supported their cause. This demonstrates that while secrecy defined parts of the Underground Railroad, in certain regions, community solidarity created space for more open defiance. By the 1840s and 1850s, the movement was reaching its most famous era. Delaware Quaker Thomas Garrett worked closely with conductors, most notably Harriet Tubman. Thomas Garrett was born in 1789 in Upper Darby, Pennsylvania, the son of prosperous Quaker farmers. His upbringing was comfortable but firmly rooted in Quaker discipline, emphasizing honesty, simplicity, and equality. One pivotal childhood moment defined him. When an enslaved family servant was kidnapped by slave catchers, Garrett was deeply shaken. This event imprinted on him the vulnerability of black lives under slavery, even in a supposedly free state. Raised with both material security and spiritual rigor, Garrett grew into a man unafraid of confrontation. His boyhood lesson, that freedom was fragile and demanded protection, shaped the conviction that would guide him for the rest of his life. And that conviction had consequences. Garrett was fined into near financial ruin after being caught aiding fugitives, but his resolve never wavered. His home became a key link between the South and Northern safe houses. And then there was the most famous conductor of the railroad, Harriet Tubman. Harriet Tubman was born Araminta Ross around 1822 on Maryland's eastern shore, the fifth of 9 children in an enslaved family owned by the Brody's household. Her early years were marked by hardship, separation, and resilience. From the start, Tubman was immersed in the harsh realities of slavery. She witnessed siblings sold away and lived with the constant fear that she, too, could be taken. As a child, she was hired out to other households, performing grueling labor far beyond her years. She worked as a nursemaid, tending to white children while enduring whippings if they cried. Later, she was sent into the fields to haul logs and trap muskrats in freezing water. The physical toll was immense, but it was an incident in her adolescence that left the most lasting mark. While intervening to stop the capture of another enslaved man, she was struck in the head by a heavy iron weight. It nearly killed her. She was left unconscious for days, and when she finally rose, she was never the same. Headaches, sudden sleep spells, and strange seizures would follow her all her life. But with them came something else, visions and dreams that she came to see as the voice of God. Tubman spoke of hearing divine guidance in moments of danger. Sometimes she described vivid images or urgent warnings that came upon her without explanation. In the woods, leading fugitives north, she would suddenly feel compelled to change course, later discovering that slave catchers had been waiting on the road ahead. To her, these experiences were not burdens but blessings, a channel through which God steered her path. Her faith in these revelations gave her a rare, unshakable confidence. Where others hesitated, Tubman moved forward, trusting the voice within. Those who followed her sensed this certainty and drew strength from it. The blow that fractured her skull had also, in her own telling, opened her spirit. From that wound came a conviction that she was chosen for a purpose, to be the Moses for her people. Harriet also absorbed strength from her parents, particularly her mother, Rit, who resisted attempts to sell her children and taught them faith and perseverance. Harriet's father, Ben Ross, skilled in timber work, also passed down knowledge of the land, woods, waterways, and stars, which would later guide her in leading others to freedom. Growing up in bondage, Harriet learned both the brutality of slavery and the resilience needed to resist it. Her childhood forged qualities, courage, faith, physical endurance, and a refusal to surrender that would define her destiny. Long before she became the Moses of her people, she was a young girl learning to survive, to dream, and fight under impossible odds. Though she was not part of the nascent stages of building the Underground Railroad, she represents the legacy in full bloom. She escaped bondage in 1849, only to return repeatedly to guide others to freedom. Tubman's courage made her the Underground Railroad's most celebrated figure, but she stood on foundations laid decades earlier by Quakers, free black leaders, and countless unnamed supporters. It's important to remember that the term Underground Railroad didn't appear until the 1830s, when America was obsessed with railroads and telegraphs. Before that, no one thought of a railroad at all. They spoke of lines of friends or simply helping hands. The Underground Railroad was never one unified system, but a patchwork of communities, individuals, and faith-driven acts of courage. Urgency to beef up the routes of the Underground Railroad came in the form of the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. When the United States Congress passed the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, it lit a fire under the national debate about slavery. For enslaved people who escaped north, the act meant their freedom was never secure. For free black families in northern cities, it meant living with constant dread of being kidnapped and dragged south. And for white northerners who had long looked away from slavery as a southern problem, the law made complicity mandatory. Overnight, slavery was no longer just in the South. It was at every doorstep in America. The law's terms were brutally stacked against fugitives. Anyone accused of being an escaped slave was hauled before a commissioner, not a judge, not a jury. They had no right to testify in their own defense. Between 1850 and 1860, 343 people were brought before commissioners. 332 were sent back to slavery. The system was financially rigged. Commissioners were paid $10 for sending someone south, but only $5 if they ruled in favor of freedom. The law didn't even define fugitives as criminals. They were simply property. A slave catcher only needed to swear an oath to reclaim them, and for anyone caught helping fugitives, the penalty was crushing. A $1,000 fine, equivalent to tens of thousands today. The Fugitive Slave Act spread terror through northern black communities. Even those who had been free for years could be seized on false claims. Almost overnight, black populations in cities like Boston, Pittsburgh, and Columbia, Pennsylvania, plummeted. In Detroit, abolitionists helped guide 1,200 African Americans into Canada. By December 1850, thousands had fled across the border. Canada, which had abolished slavery in 1834 under British law, became the safest refuge. Families were torn apart in the scramble to escape. Hotel waiters in Pittsburgh vanished. Whole neighborhoods in Boston were suddenly emptied. What had once been tenuous safety in the North became open vulnerability. The law also ignited waves of resistance. In Boston, the arrest of Shadrach Minkins, a fugitive waiter, led to a daring rescue by black abolitionists who stormed the courthouse and spirited him away. The case of Anthony Burns in 1854 brought national outrage when he was marched through Boston in chains under federal guard. John Price was freed in Oberlin, Ohio, after townspeople defied the law and rescued him. These cases turned fugitives into symbols, their stories rallying abolitionists and sharpening the moral crisis. As author Andrew Delbanco notes, Northerners who had once ignored slavery now felt its weight in their own streets. Southern slaveholders pushed for the Fugitive Slave Act because they saw the Underground Railroad flourishing. To them, the law was a defense of property rights. To abolitionists, it was proof that slavery poisoned the entire republic. The law demanded that Northerners, even those who opposed slavery, became active participants in its enforcement. Many refused. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 didn't silence fugitives. It multiplied them. It didn't stop abolitionists. It radicalized them. And it didn't strengthen the Union. It shattered it further. The law pushed thousands into Canada, gave the Underground Railroad new urgency, and forced the North to confront the inhumanity of slavery directly. By trying to chain fugitives tighter, the Fugitive Slave Act instead accelerated the nation's march toward civil war. It remains one of the most infamous laws in American history, a reminder that injustice written into law cannot stand forever, and that defiance and escape from such laws are morally justifiable. And what were those escapes really like? Let's turn now to the grueling journey a slave would take so that freedom in their bodies matched the freedom in their hearts. The night was thick with summer heat, the air heavy as if the world itself held its breath. John, born into bondage, lay on the dirt floor of the cabin, staring at the faint moonlight that slipped through the cracks in the boards. Beside him, Mary's hand trembled in his own. For weeks they had whispered of this night. Now it was here. The plantation slept, but sleep was a fragile thing in a place where whips cracked by day and chains rattled by night. John had worked the cotton rows until his hands were raw. Mary had bent over wash tubs until her body ached like an old woman's. They were young, barely in their 20s, but already life felt carved in exhaustion. And then rumors had reached them. Rumors of a woman who moved through the night, leading people north. A woman said to hear God's voice in visions. A woman called Moses. John pressed Mary's hand. "It's time," he said as he kissed her forehead. They rose quickly, careful not to wake the others, and slipped out into the night. The plantation stretched behind them. Endless rows of cotton glistened in moonlight. The overseer's house stood dark, but John swore he could feel its eyes watching. Every step was a betrayal of the system that owned them. Every step was rebellion. The forest swallowed them quickly, its shadows thick and restless. The sounds were sharper here, branches creaking, cicadas buzzing, frogs croaking in the marsh. Each sound was magnified by fear. Every twig snap was a hunter's boot. Every dog bark in the distance was a bloodhound catching scent. Mary's breath came fast. John whispered, "Keep low, keep quiet." But even whispering felt dangerous, like casting their voices into the hands of the night. Hours passed in silence until their legs burned with fatigue. Hunger gnawed, thirst scrapped their throats raw, and then, near dawn, they reached a clearing. A figure stood waiting, small in frame but gigantic in spirit, wrapped in a shawl, eyes fierce and determined in the half-light. The light of freedom, the Moses of her people. Harriet Tubman. John froze, breath caught in his chest. He had heard the stories, but seeing her was like seeing a miracle walk in human form. She spoke in a low, steady voice. "We move quickly. We move together. Don't look back," Tubman instructed John and Mary. But then her body stiffened. Her gaze lifted skyward as if listening to something unseen. For a long moment she was silent. Then she whispered, "Not that way. They're waiting." She pointed to a narrow path veering left. No explanation, only certainty. John and Mary obeyed. Later they would see the hoofprints of mounted men along the road they'd avoided. Tubman's vision, strange and sudden, had saved them. The journey had begun. Days bled into nights. Nights bled into days. Time lost meaning when every hour was survival. They walked by stars, guided by Tubman's low words. "There's the North Star. Keep it at your shoulder," she instructed. They drank from streams that tasted of iron and mud. They moved through forests alive with sound, owls screeching, branches snapping, wind moaning like voices. The forest was no sanctuary. It was a test. Sometimes they trudged through swamps where mud sucked at their ankles and mosquitoes swarmed so thick they felt suffocated. John's arms were welted with bites. Mary's skirts dragged heavy with muck. The smell of stagnant water clung to them. At night, when they dared to rest, Tubman sometimes sang in a low hum, "Go down, Moses, way down in Egypt's land." The hymn wrapped around them like a shield. It reminded them that their suffering was ancient, that others had walked paths of bondage and deliverance before. The safe houses became lifelines. A Quaker farmhouse tucked behind rows of corn. A cabin owned by a free black family near the edge of a river. Ordinary homes transformed into sanctuaries. Inside, the smell of cornbread baking, beans simmering on a hearth. Quilts spread on the floor where fugitives slept. The creaks of floorboards as hosts moved carefully, their voices hushed. The walls themselves seemed to hold their breath. For a few hours, John and Mary were not property. They were simply people, allowed to close their eyes without chains. But even safety was sharp-edged. A knock at the door could mean betrayal. Neighbors who smiled by day could mumble to slave catchers by night. John and Mary learned to sit in corners, backs to the wall, eyes darting to every sound. Tubman remained steady. When her visions came, she obeyed them instantly. One night, halfway across an open field, she froze. "Back," she said in a low voice. They obeyed, retreating into the trees. Hours later, riders thundered across the very path they had meant to take. Her certainty became her compass. Faith replaced fear. And still, exhaustion pressed down. John's legs cramped. Mary's feet bled. Hunger hollowed them. Yet each step north was defiance. Each step proof that their bodies belonged to them. Weeks passed. The nights grew cooler. One evening, Tubman said in a hushed voice, "We're close." They reached the banks of the Ohio River at dawn. The water churned with spring rains, silver under the rising sun. On the far bank lay Ohio, free soil. The sight made John's knees weak. Mary wept silently, her shoulders shaking. Freedom was close enough to touch, yet separated by a river that looked ready to swallow them. A small boat awaited, hidden in reeds. Its wooden planks smelled of pitch and river water. They climbed in, hearts pounding. Tubman took the oar. "Hold fast," she said, her voice carrying over the roar of the water. The boat lurched, waves slapping hard. Water spilled over the sides, soaking their clothes. Mary clung to John, terror in her eyes. Harriet's gaze was fixed ahead, calm, unflinching. "The Lord brought you this far. He won't leave you now," she shouted above the wind like it was the 11th commandment. Somehow, against the current, they reached the far shore. John staggered out, falling to his knees, clutching the earth as though it were treasure. Mary pressed her hands to the soil, tears streaming down her face. For the first time, they stood on land where their bodies were not legally owned. The Underground Railroad was never tracks or tunnels. It was the sound of twigs snapping in the dark, the rasp of breath in a forest, the hush of prayers in hidden rooms. It was fear, hunger, exhaustion, but also faith, hope, and the unyielding courage of those who believed freedom was worth everything. For John and Mary, and for thousands more, it was not history written in books. It was lived, step by trembling step, through swamps and forests, rivers and visions, until the word freedom became flesh beneath their feet. When the Civil War erupted in 1861, the railroad itself changed shape. It no longer ended in the North or Canada alone. Suddenly, freedom seekers discovered a new destination: Union lines. Every advancing regiment of the Union Army became a moving beacon of hope. For enslaved men and women, war meant not only the possibility of rescue, but the chance to transform themselves from property into soldiers, workers, free citizens. Union camps became magnets for the self-emancipated. The war turned the Underground Railroad from secret trails into wide-open highways. Agents and abolitionists shifted their work, guiding fugitives not just toward northern states, but toward Union strongholds. Kansas became a sanctuary after entering the Union as a free state in 1861. No longer were escapees slipping into attics or cellars. Now they were marching into Union lines, sometimes in broad daylight, sometimes entire families together. The railroad had grown louder, bolder, a torrent rather than a trickle. For Southerners, this was a nightmare realized. Slavery was bleeding away with every step an enslaved person took toward Union lines, whether by Harriet Tubman or otherwise. For Northerners, the sight of thousands fleeing into camps erased any illusion that war could remain about preserving the Union alone. The war was about freedom. By war's end, nearly 500,000 enslaved people had liberated themselves by fleeing to Union lines. The Underground Railroad, once a shadow system of hidden allies, had expanded into a mass movement of self-emancipation. Every Union campfire was a beacon. Every regiment, a rolling station on a railroad that could no longer be denied. The Civil War did not just destroy slavery by law, it destroyed it in practice, as enslaved men and women walked, ran, sailed, and fought their way to freedom. The railroad's secret lanterns became bonfires. The whispered hymns became marching songs. In the end, the Civil War revealed what the railroad had always embodied: the courage of the enslaved themselves. Conductors, abolitionists, and Union soldiers played their part, but the heart of the story lies with the men and women who chose to risk everything. With trembling hands, they rowed canoes into dangerous waters. With pounding hearts, they crossed lines bristling with guns. With visions, faith, and sheer defiance, they turned war into liberation. The Civil War did not end the Underground Railroad. It became its final, blazing chapter when the railroad became a river, carrying hundreds of thousands to freedom and carrying a nation toward a reckoning it could no longer escape. The story of the Underground Railroad does not end with slaves like John and Mary crossing into Canada, nor with the Civil War's final gunshots. Its legacy has stretched far beyond the forests, rivers, and safe houses that once sheltered fugitives. It has become both memory and metaphor, a symbol of courage, resilience, and the human will to be free. In the decades since emancipation, the Underground Railroad has been retold in many forms: in family stories passed down through generations, in abolitionist memoirs like William Still's The Underground Railroad Records, and in novels, music, and film. Some of those retellings have been mythic, stories more legend than fact. But even the myths show how powerful the longing for freedom remains in our cultural imagination. And yet, the legacy is not only symbolic. In 1998, the U.S. Congress passed the National Underground Railroad Network to Freedom Act, signed by President Bill Clinton. This act entrusted the National Park Service to identify and preserve the real places where this story unfolded. Today, hundreds of sites across the country are part of that network: humble farmhouses, old churches, river crossings, and towns that once hummed with whispers of escape. Each site is a light kept burning, reminding us that ordinary people, black and white, enslaved and free, risked everything to challenge the machinery of slavery. 2 national parks honor the most famous conductor, Harriet Tubman. In 2013, President Barack Obama created the Harriet Tubman Underground Railroad National Historical Park on Maryland's eastern shore, where Tubman was born and first fled from bondage. 4 years later, in Auburn, New York, another Tubman Park was established, preserving her home and her later years of activism. Walking these grounds, visitors stand not only in her footsteps, but in the footsteps of those she led, those who believed her visions, and those who found freedom because she refused to turn back. September has been named International Underground Railroad Month, marking the month when both Harriet Tubman and Frederick Douglass made their own escapes. It is a season of remembrance, honoring not just heroes whose names we know, but also the thousands whose names were lost to history, the Johns and Marys, the families who fled by night, the ones who never stopped running. The legacy of the Underground Railroad also lives in art. Colson Whitehead's novel, The Underground Railroad, won both the National Book Award and the Pulitzer Prize, imagining the railroad as a literal train beneath the earth. The story was later adapted into a haunting television series. Other works, from graphic novels to hip-hop collectives, have borrowed its name and imagery, transforming it into a broader symbol of resistance and liberation. The Underground Railroad was never a railroad. It was a network of humanity. It was the creak of a wagon wheel on a midnight road, the smell of cornbread in a Quaker farmhouse, the cry of a newborn muffled against its mother's shoulder in a hiding place beneath the floor. Its legacy today is the reminder that freedom is not given. It is taken, defended, and carried forward by those brave enough to risk everything. To remember the Underground Railroad is to remember not only how people escaped slavery, but how they taught us all what it means to be free. I hope you enjoyed this deep dive into the people, places, and nature that shaped the Underground Railroad. If you are still awake, please remember to give this video a like and share and subscribe to the channel. And if you are still awake after that, we have more weird and compelling history for you to doze off to. Good night.